Thank you for those really encouraging and inspiring words. I'm very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker today. Timmons Roberts is Ittleson Professor of Sociology and Environmental Studies at Brown University, where he's also the director of the Climate and Development Lab. I want to introduce Timmons to you by telling you about his contributions, some of his contributions to Tulane. As a faculty member here in the 1990s, he made a lasting impact. He created the course Environmental Sociology, which is still very popular and a core course in our environmental studies curriculum. Students in his environmental sociology class did the first environmental assessment of Tulane, and that project helped launch Tulane's environmental sustainability programs. Among his many books, he's the co-author of Chronicles from the Environmental Justice Front Lines, which is a 2001 study that documents 4 nationally important environmental justice issues here in Louisiana. These themes of close collaboration with students, research and teaching tied to action, and a focus on environmental justice run through Timmons' work. The title of his talk today is Understanding and Confronting the Injustice of Climate Change, Vulnerability, Responsibility, and Action from the UN to Washington and right at home. Please join me in welcoming Timmons Roberts back to Tulane.
Thank you so much, Liz. It's pretty emotional coming back. Looking out at the audience, seeing old friends. I came back Saturday and had a blast at Cru de Vue, and it reminded me how much I miss New Orleans. And it's been just a wonderful reunion with old students and old colleagues and friends. So, and I'm sorry I've missed some people, so my apologies up front. I have a lot of gratitude for Tulane and my colleagues and students here for the support and community that we've had working on the environment. And just personally, I think the most important thing I am grateful for is, my son had leukemia. He was 5 months old, and the community here really supported us, my wife and I, as we took care of him. And that meant a lot. And I survived. I got tenure. I spent 10 years here, and I really loved it. And working with undergraduates and graduates in environmental studies, in sociology, and in Latin American studies, I learned a lot. And I think I've really taken forward, I'm also working with community groups in the environmental movement, and taking forward that sort of attention to working together and combining sort of scholarship with activism is something I'd like to make sure I get to talk about today, because that's what the committee asked me to do. And I want to thank the committee who organized this, and Liz and Tom and Cher and Shelley, and everybody else who worked on this. The students who are over here, I saw some of you all, and out there at the table, I'm sure, who did all this work. So I think it's really exciting to see Tulane doing this. It's great to hear Vice President Norton talking about this ability to go carbon neutral, which I can talk about at the end of this. So the way I framed up this talk was to have sort of 2 sections. There's actually going to be 5 sections, but I want to talk about the injustice of climate change, and then I want to talk about action. So how does this thing work? Who knows? There we go. All right, so here's a roadmap. I want to talk about climate change. It's sort of the evidence for climate change really briefly. I mean, I know everybody knows this, but there's no reason not to say something very briefly. Talk about what do we expect and what's at stake. In other words, why care? Secondly, I'll talk about injustice and climate change, something I wrote about a lot in this book that's on the top of the screen called Climate of Injustice. Talk about vulnerability to climate change, who's most vulnerable and who's most responsible, which is just basic, justice issues. There's a lot more to that issue. And then I have this third section about what would adequate and equitable action on climate change look like And I'm focused on the international level in this. There are, of course, local and much smaller scale levels of climate injustice that I'm going to spend less time on. I'd be happy to talk about as we have discussion at the end. I'm going to try to keep myself short so that we have lots of time for that. And then something about the political moment that we're in. I'm sure you're guessing what I'm talking about there. And then how we got here. And then finally wrap up talking about how to confront it and some things that we can do to make a difference. So there we go. Ready? This is first part one. Is climate change happening? Is the Earth warming? The answer, yes, it's warming. This is global mean temperatures are up 1 degree Celsius, about almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the about 1880s. That's a lot. I mean, in geologic, we've lived in a time of stability for basically the entire rise of our civilization. Here's why it's happening, especially carbon dioxide concentrations are this black line, and they are shooting up. And this is then, sort of temperatures, global mean temperatures, and they are rising as predicted. I mean, this has been predicted for over 140 or 50 years, really, that this was going to happen. Here's the basic science of it, right? Sunlight is pouring over the Earth all the time, but this increasing layer of carbon dioxide is, this layer here is making making more of the heat that radiates off the Earth stay within our atmosphere and warming us up. So it's like rolling up the windows of your car. So here's, at Mauna Loa, in the volcano in Hawaii, since the 1950s, they've been collecting, vats of air and then measuring how much carbon dioxide. So you can see it's sort of been, and then they used ice cores to track it. This is very strange. It has 2 pointers. So it's been between this sort of level of 200 parts per million and about 300 parts per million. And then here we are, literally in the last, that last graph, we're up above 400 parts per million. So this is a level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that has not been there for over 800,000 years. And then was it just, natural cycles? I was talking to a guy the other day saying, isn't it just natural cycles? Well, if you just look at the natural cycles, this is what you would predict, but this is what we're actually seeing is this black line, and so the human factors are really the only way to explain what's happening. Let's see. This is an old IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change figure. The dates aren't so important. We're not sure exactly when this stuff is going to happen, but this is the kind of things, as the temperature rises a little bit, we start to see coral reef bleaching. This is already happening. Polar ecosystems are increasingly damaged, as we're hitting 1 degree of warming. And then, you've heard about these other things that are expected to happen. Coral reefs bleached, rainforest habitats lost in Queensland, endemic plant losses, and then going all the way up to, ecosystems may not be able to adapt. Nature reserves can't fulfill their objectives, extinctions around the globe. Anyway, it's really dire as we get up to about 4 degrees or above. So our goal is to try to bend this curve and to keep ourselves below 2 degrees or, hopefully 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. Is that making sense? Okay, so on to the stuff that you guys maybe haven't heard a million times. So I'm talking about the injustice of climate change, and this is an index of who's most vulnerable in the world, if you sort of map that. And you can see even in some of the wealthy countries, like here in North America, there are places that are more vulnerable. It also shows how in all countries in the world, there's high levels of vulnerability in different places, depending on flooding risks. It's also in terms of poverty and the ability of people to sort of prepare for, cope with, and then recover from these increasing disasters that are coming. Flooding, hurricanes, droughts, heat waves. So, one of the big things is vulnerability to flooding. Of course, it's everywhere that there are coastal cities, but no place is more than the Mississippi Delta, the Nile River Delta, and the Ganges Delta in Bangladesh, especially. 100 million people living in areas that are just barely above sea level and are getting hammered. So when I take students to the UN climate negotiations, which I've been doing since about 2010, we try to help out the least developed countries group. So this is the countries that are in that group. They negotiate together for about 25 years now. The LDCs, the least developed countries, there are 48 countries, mostly in Africa, the poorest ones in the world. And then some other, some small island states out here and some South Asian. And then in the Western Hemisphere, it's just Haiti. So we did a little analysis that we put out in a policy briefing that showed that there are about 11% of the world's population lives in those countries. They experience about 21% of the global sort of climate-related disasters. But then there are over half of the number of people who die from these climate disasters. So, you're sort of controlling for a lot of things here, and you can see that people there are 5 times more likely than we are to die from climate disasters, climate-related disasters. So I don't have slides from Hurricane Katrina here. It's a little bit different, but this is, I prepared these 2 slides for a presentation in New Jersey at Rutgers. And this was when the Superstorm Sandy came over the dune and flooded parts of New Jersey. And 106 people died. I mean, in Katrina, what the estimates are, about 2,000 died. Is that the right number? 1,836. Thanks. So this is a map, some pictures from Myanmar, Burma. And there's a hurricane called Nargis, Cyclone Nargis. How many people have heard of Cyclone Nargis? So isn't that amazing? So in Cyclone Nargis, these people had nowhere to go. They had no warning system. They lived in a dictatorship and under extreme poverty. They were huddling on the roads as 140, 150 mile an hour winds came by and then flooding. I mean, it's almost unimaginable. There was almost no media there, no NGOs or anything. And 138,000 people died in that. And that was just now 10 years ago, and you don't even hear about it. And here, like 3 people in this room have heard of this storm. So anyway, just to say, this is an example of the extreme. I can't even look at that picture of extreme inequality. And this to me is the sort of the climate justice paradox. The people who are the least responsible in the world are the most vulnerable to the impacts. So if we took those same LDC countries, those 48 countries emit less than 1% of all the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that are up there in the atmosphere. So they're the least responsible and the most vulnerable. So who is responsible? Here's just a couple of quick slides on this. This is just a very visual way of presenting that information. Is the Earth from space at night, right? You can see where the electricity is being burned. Sorry, is that the right way to say that? Where the fossil fuels are being burned to create the electricity to light up the night sky. You can see there's just very dark places around the planet. This is from a Ecuadorian NGO called Amigos de la Tierra en Acción Ecológica, who say, who owes who? They consider there's a climate debt that wealthy countries owe to the poor countries because of what we've done to the atmosphere. So, and just behind that are, I think there's an ethical argument of there being 2 different kinds of emissions, the pollution of poverty and the pollution of wealth. And for poor people, they do need they do need energy, whether it's fossil or not. But a lot of their destruction of the environment is just trying to secure their needs for firewood, for warmth, for clothing and shelter, traveling by foot, bicycle, or bus, cooking local foods in unheated, unair-conditioned, tiny homes built of simple local materials. Their emissions on a per capita basis are almost negligible globally. So what I'm trying to say is that the responsibility of solving this problem is mostly not theirs. And yet in the UN negotiations, of course, there's a lot of pressure on them to make commitments and so on to reduce their emissions, which is highly ironic, I think. So then here we are in the north with our large homes, our many and increasingly polluting cars, excessive luxury foods that are flown and shipped all over the planet, and our products transported over tremendous distances. And I would say, in our consumption of meat and other things that are really high energy. This is just total emissions in the world. Per capita, and this is total emissions, so if it was per capita, unfortunately this site called carbonmap.org didn't have per capita. But here it is if you look historically at the emissions, which countries have emitted the most. And this is important because, carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere 100 years. So the problem that we're experiencing now is largely the result of this historical emissions. So, that's the vulnerability and responsibility story. Is that simple enough? So that's the injustice. So what would adequate, an equitable climate action look like? This is a graph from a guy named Glenn Peters at the Norwegian think tank called Cicero. And this black line at the top is sort of our carbon budget. This is all we can emit if we're going to stay under 2 degrees of warming and avoid all those impacts that I had on the screen a minute ago. So that's what we've got. And here's what's happening down here at the bottom. This is the United States. So we've used this big chunk. Here's Europe. And then here's China with this big increase in the emissions. Here we are in 2014 when he got there. China seems to be leveling off, right? What happens in China is really going to determine what happens with all of our future. And China emissions leveled off from 2013 to 2016, we think, much earlier than expected. And their pledge in the Paris negotiations was to peak their emissions by 2030. So we're all very excited, and it seems like they're ahead of schedule. Unfortunately, in 2017, the estimates were that they increased again by 3.5%. And that led the global emissions to increase about 3% on average. So you can see how much impact they have. Just end of last week, there was a study coming out that said it was probably closer to 1% emissions increase in coal burning in China. So we don't know what's going on in China, and part of the problem is the data is so bad and questionable. It's a big problem for understanding this problem. So this is what we've got, and then we've got the rest of the world, or about 5 billion people, are left if we have to share this global budget. That tiny and shrinking piece. So in other words, those of us who have been emitting all this time are sort of hogging what's there to use. Does that make sense? So we've got to share this more equitably, in my opinion. So Glenn Peters goes on. I don't know how well you're going to see this, but this is China at the bottom. Here's their pledges through the Paris Agreement, whether they have help or whether they don't have help. Don't know why that's doing that. Here's what they need to do in terms of, if we want to stay below 2 degrees, here's what they need to do if we're going to do that equitably, fairly, and share that carbon budget. Here's Europe. Here's their pledge, 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. Here's what's been going on in Europe in terms of emissions, total emissions. Here's what they need to do to get to near zero by 2050. Here's the United States at the top. Here's what we've been doing. We've had this drop in emissions since about 2008. That's great news, if it's true, because largely it's because of our shift to natural gas from coal. And there's a lot of dispute about how much natural gas is leaking into the atmosphere. And of course, methane leakage is terrible in the short term for warming. And it could be much worse than what the EPA is actually reporting and how they do the estimates. Here's our pledges. This was Obama's pledge for 17% below 2005 levels by 2020, which we were on track for. And then 26 to 28%, this is our Paris Agreement pledge by 2025. So we are going down. These are meaningful pledges, but they would only get us, this is 87% by 2005. If we're going to share the carbon budget equitably, this is what we need to do. This is a shocker. This has us basically down to zero by 2035 in the United States, and really damn close to it by 2030. So, how do we do that? I'm going to argue that this is what an equitable global sharing of the carbon budget would look like, and it's going to require, I would say, sort of a wartime mobilization if it's possible in this country. That's a big if. But in World War II, the United States totally transformed its economy in about 3 years. So what I'm talking about here is about 17 years that the science says we need to to transform our economy. And I actually think it's exciting that, it's daunting, but there's amazing opportunities here that we would create a whole new categories of jobs. We would transform our societies in ways that might be a lot healthier, certainly will be a lot healthier. And that's, I think, a lot of the sort of climate justice argument that I'm talking about less, but I hope the other speakers are going to talk about more, is the public health side of anywhere there's fossil fuel burning, there are public health impacts of NOx and SOx, nitrogen and sulfur oxides, that create smog, of ozone, of particulates which cause asthma, and are devastating for children and people with cardiopulmonary diseases in cities and places around the world. So there's great benefits for our health, for our societies. Anyway, so this is daunting, but it's, I would say if we do it, we're going to reap a lot of benefits and we'll actually have a stable climate. So this is an assessment of the Paris Agreement done by a group called Climate Interactive, or Climate Action Tractor. There's two groups that do this, and they're sort of similar. This shows sort of what was going on before the Paris Agreement, that looked like we're headed to about 3.6 degrees of warming, which is pretty devastating. With the Paris pledges, it got us down to about 2.7 degrees of warming. And these are big round estimates, but the Paris Agreement, while inadequate, right? Is 2.7 degrees of warming adequate? Are you okay with that? I'm not. I hope you're not. Is it adequate? No. Is it a step in the right direction? Yes. Is it something that should be thrown away? No. It was a major achievement. And it also includes in it these mechanisms to ratchet down and for countries to sort of ratchet up their ambition every 5 years. So it's, I would say it's inadequate, but it should be defended because it's a step and it's a real global agreement. And 1 degree less warming reduces the chances of some of the worst impacts in important ways. It's sort of on that distribution of expected terrible things happening, it sort of cuts off some of those really terrible things. Here's an assessment by a group called the Civil Society Review, started by a group called ecoequity.org, one of my favorite little think tanks, tiny, it's like 3 guys. But then this was signed on by hundreds of NGOs around the world. And it shows that in the Paris Agreement that this is the fair share, that the wealthy countries should be reducing their emissions by 26 gigatons and the poorer countries by 9. But then this is what actually happened in the Paris round, that the wealthy countries only pledged about 6 gigatons of reductions. And the poorer countries pledged even more. And then if they have some support, they could do, this much more with what are called conditional pledges. So they call this the ambition gap. So we've got a huge gap that we need to work on to push our governments to pledge more, and our companies and our institutions and to work on ourselves. So the second part of that, this section was going to be about, is this possible and is there any hope? And I think, what I described as this big transition is actually getting to be extremely feasible because we're now into this grid parity zone for renewable energy. As solar, wind, geothermal energy, wave and tidal energies are coming on. There's opportunities for great innovation, extremely important, as Vice President Norton said. Storage is a big deal, through batteries or pumped hydro, pumping the water back up the hill and when you have extra energy at night. Charging up your electric car at night when there's extra cheap wind power, and then using that in the late afternoon for those peak times or at the times when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. So we're headed into this part right now where it's already, cheaper for you to put solar panels on your house than it is to use natural gas or coal. So this is from now almost 2 years ago that already 20 states were at grid parity, and this keeps increasing. And Louisiana is included in that list down here. Here's Louisiana. So it's cheaper already because of the solar conditions. And it also matters, what the incentives are and so on. But in other words, people should be thinking about avoiding other kinds of energy and installing the panels. It's paying for itself in a shorter and shorter amount of time. There's better financing mechanisms, and it's, solar is really taking off, and wind power, of course. So I'm trying to save a lot of time here. So when am I supposed to stop? Yeah, but there has to be time for discussion. So I'll go for 10 more minutes. How about that? So the political moment, how we got here. Are you ready? So here's the big problem. If we're going to stay under that carbon budget, we have to keep about 80% of all fossil fuels in the ground. So here's the amount that we've burned so far. Well, this was through 2020. And this is how much we burned in the first decade of this century. And then here's what we can burn and stay under that carbon budget that I showed you. And here's what's just unburnable. So $22 trillion worth of resources need to stay in the ground. That is our greatest challenge, right? These are actors who are counting on or expecting that money, those $22 trillion. A lot of them are public, right? They're actually, traded publicly. That's this slice down here, $7 trillion. We can pressure them through campaigns on their, for shareholders. They have stock that's publicly traded. But unfortunately, 3/4 of these are national, like the Saudi Arabian State Oil Company or the Russian State Oil. This is really hard. How do you pressure those guys? The Venezuelan, PVDESPA. In Brazil, it's quasi-state, anyway, these are politically connected groups that are going to fight. And same with these are private ones that aren't even traded on the stock markets. So this is, I think, really the core of the problem. So the political moment is, of course, President Trump went to the Rose Garden and announced on June 1st that he was pulling out of the Paris Agreement and said it was a bad deal for the United States. He's cut our contribution to the Green Climate Fund, which Obama had pledged $3 billion for. Obama managed to get $1 billion out the door before he left office, but then there's still $2 billion that the world was sort of counting on. That was a good faith pledge made before the Paris Agreement. That was part of why the poor countries made some of those ambitious pledges that they showed on that ambition gap. And here the U.S. has pulled out. The total from the wealthy countries was $10 billion, so we now have pulled out 20% of the whole pledge for the wealthy world. And then he's dismantling, of course, the Clean Power Plan, which is the state-by-state plan to reduce emissions in different ways in each state. So you know about all this, right? So where did that decision come from? The key player was, of course, Scott Pruitt, sitting beaming in the front row during that Rose Garden announcement, Attorney General from Oklahoma, head of the EPA. Here's where some of his donations for his campaigns for those offices came, about $300,000 from fossil fuel industries, natural gas, Exxon, and the Koch brothers and so on. Murray Energy, that's coal companies and so on. So there's this whole network that's supporting him. And he's just, one face on really a much more complex issue. And this has been sort of a building power structure. There's an emerging sociology trying to understand how does this movement work, especially in the United States. Why is it that the United States is so unlike, very much unlike the rest of the world in the fact that there's such a high level of climate denial? That is, strong groups denying the reality of climate change or whether we should act on it, whether it's natural or human-made, and whether it's something we should leave for somebody else. So one of the key moments was the founding of the American Petroleum Institute 100 years ago this year. This is at Standard Oil's headquarters where they founded it. They spend $241 million a year on lobbying against any kind of climate action. And they're damned effective. So here's an old cartoon. I'm not sure exactly when this is from. I think it's from the 40s. showing Standard Oil, this oil tank with octopus taking over the state houses. So here's the state houses up in the upper right corner. Here's the Capitol, and then they're reaching for the White House. Well, and then these are some other industrial efforts, and then they're reaching overseas and so on. I kind of like this because they're reaching for the White House. Well, we know that now they have the White House. So here's the modern equivalent, the same analogy of the Koch brothers, who, of course, made their money mostly in natural gas and pipelines. So they have a whole extremely complex network of extremely well-funded with lots of other donors as well that have really, I think, shaped the national discourse on this issue and a lot of other issues. That is, they're strong libertarians that believe that there's almost no role for the government and the government is nothing but a problem. And hello. Let's see if we could get this back. So they're funding programs at universities. So Tulane and Brown both have programs funded by Koch brothers and other oil industries. These are all university insignias up here. If you can squint and find us. They have influence in the courtrooms, in Congress. They have many, congressional House and representatives and senators that they've funded their campaigns. They have these sort of groups that influence legislation, like ALEC, the American Legislative, what's it called again? Something Council. Exchange Council, thanks. They write bills and pass them out that are bills that are largely written by corporations that they then try to get passed in legislatures around the country, and they're very effective. They have sort of the AstroTurf groups, that is, groups that look like social movement organizations, but they're often funded from above and created secretly. There's a bunch of really influential think tanks, the Heritage Foundation, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and on, that are very effective and are running the country right now, in my opinion. And then they have people in the media that are very effective. So you get the idea that this is, I think, a really important thing for us to understand. So my colleague, Bob Brule, he's at Drexel University, did some very preliminary research this summer, tracking a lot of the money from both the environmental movement side and from the, sort of the conservative movements and industry movements on how much they're spending on different parts of the struggle. So this is political contributions, so campaign contributions, and it shows that environmental organizations are putting out about 18%. So and if you add the renewable energy sector, that's 19%. So about 5 to 1 being spent by fossil fuel industries and utilities and other polluting industries who would be resisting climate action. You with me? So they're getting outspent on campaigns 5 to 1. That's pretty bad. But if you look at lobbying, it's far worse. It's like about 5% at the most if you add up the environmentalists and the renewable energy people versus the other sectors. So it's about 20 to 1. So lobbying, going to Washington and influencing the shape of our legislation through manipulating our legislators and even the agencies that are supposed to carry out these laws. The environmental movement is not spending its money well. And then here's advertisements. So every Sunday morning, if you ever watch those Sunday morning, Meet the Press kind of shows, Face the Nation, you just see endless ads for fossil fuel corporations and how they're taking care of us, and we should not worry about this issues of like climate change or coastal erosion in Louisiana, for example. Or in other ways, talking about how important their fossil fuels are, and environmental organizations just are missing in action. So I would say environmental organizations and the foundations that support them have really failed to invest in advertising campaigns, lobbying, think tanks, universities, and the coordination that's really been the characteristics of the conservative movement. Maybe in spite of all that, there has been a political response to Trump's withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, right? The states and cities have said, we're still in. We're going to we're going to make pledges about continuing to fight for, the U.S. achieving its pledged 26 to 28% emissions reductions. Any ideas on this? Sorry, Jerry Brown, governor of California, has convened some major efforts. If anybody can go in September, there's going to be a big climate change conference out there. Bloomberg, former mayor of New York, at the UN negotiations set up a think tank, a climate action dome. I'm guessing it's like this plug here. No? Something in this mass of wires. So the whole point of that thing was saying that we're still in, and university presidents have come out with some pledges and so on. The cities are actually one of the places of some of the most ambitious pledges. It's flickering up here too. So 605 cities representing 445 million people have made pledges saying that they're still in, committing to this thing called the Compact of Mayors. My mayor in Providence, Rhode Island, signed a pledge to go carbon neutral by 2050. Isn't that exciting? So I'm really proud of him. They have no plan on how the hell they're going to do it. And that, I think that's okay, because we don't really know what technologies are going to be available down the line. We can start planning from where we are, ramp up all the existing programs. There he is, Mayor Jorge Alorza, signing this thing. Thanks. These pledges, I think, are a big deal. States, there's, the university pledges are a big deal, and then actually fulfilling them. So I think there's a lot of ways that we can confront this injustice. I'm finally at the end here, you guys. And I think there's ways that we can turn this current moment into more adequate and equitable action. I mean, really, we should have been acting 20 years ago, much more aggressively as a country, but here we are. So there's attention that we need to pay in Washington to push back on the effort to sort of withdraw from the Paris Agreement. I actually think it's possible that Trump will, decide, oh, well, we shouldn't withdraw. The technical detail, of course, is that he can't officially withdraw until the day after the election in 2020. It was just the way the Paris Agreement came into effect, and they said you have to wait 4 years before you can withdraw. So it's actually quite sort of convenient that that he can't withdraw formally for quite a long time. So he has a lot of time to think about this, and he's now letting out more signals that he might stand. And I do think that the congressional delegations are really important on this and on climate change more generally. So I would encourage people to be in touch with your representatives and your senators, whether you live in Louisiana. I know a lot of you guys are from other states, from all over the country. It can make a big difference. On my flight coming down here, I had to go through Washington, D.C., and I ran into Sheldon Whitehouse, who's our Rhode Island senator. And he's a real climate champion. He's given 150 speeches on the floor of the U.S. Senate. And he said, there's a lot of these senators from other states who are Republicans who can't say that they support climate action because they're afraid that they will be, ousted in a primary election by somebody to their right who's from the Tea Party or from, has a more extreme position on climate change denial. But he says if people are out there supporting them, if they have enough funding, to guarantee their survival, as he says, their safe passage to some kind of climate policy like a carbon tax or something, that they could, they could be the people who come over. And then he thinks that the Republicans really have to come through with some kind of policy option because climate change is getting so bad. I mean, public opinion really is swinging. The Republican young people are, of course, very concerned about climate change, and so this party doesn't have a future unless they do something. And as he thinks, the carbon pricing or carbon taxes are the most sort of market-friendly way to deal with the issue, the least intrusive mechanism. That is, put a price on it. His legislation would put a price about $48 a ton of carbon dioxide emitted, which is estimated to be about the social cost that the rest of us are paying in the subsidy to the fossil fuel industry. In other words, they're dumping all these nasty things on us, like health impacts and climate change, and so it would, to level this playing field, To reduce that subsidy, you'd need to put about a $48 tax. I include climate finance here as another thing that we need to pay attention to. That's $2 billion especially. We promised that, and those poor countries need that, even if they're just going to reduce their emissions, let alone adapt to and cope with these climate impacts. They need funding. They need help from us, and it's a good investment. It's a lot cheaper than sending the military over to stop terrorist organizations and deal with climate refugees, which is extremely expensive as people spread across borders and destabilize whole regions because of droughts and flooding and so on. And then, of course, we need to stop this rollback in our domestic programs like the Clean Power Plan. So there's work to be done in Washington. But I think a lot of our impact can be greatest when we act locally and at the state level. So there's a lot you can do as individuals. You probably have heard many of these things before, and you'll hear them again on things like what kind of cars you buy or use, or whether you use public transportation or biking, or what kind of food you eat, if you eat local or vegetarian, if you're the size of your home that you choose, and whether you choose it to be close to your workplace, and all these things. I mean, you can make a huge difference. What else? Also influencing your institutions. There's organizations like Interfaith Power and Light that helps churches reduce their energy waste, or put renewables on their huge church roofs, or to collectively, they lobby really for more equitable and adequate climate action. They're church people, churches, synagogues, temples, mosques, etc., that are concerned about climate change. So they're working together to support each other and move this thing forward. And then, of course, there's work to be done in universities. And I'm so thrilled to see this work going forward that we started so long ago. It means a lot. I think universities, as we argued in that thing, are like small cities. Tulane, with its employees, is over 10,000 people. It also is, you guys are learning skills by working on those issues that you can take out into the world, on how to solve problems on the technical side, on the social and organizational side, and on how to make change. So there's a lot to be learned. And then, let's see, state targets. States can do more. Even in a state like Louisiana can benefit from reducing waste and, making a transition. It's, if you didn't notice, pretty warm and sunny here. And so there's a lot of potential for solar and other kinds of renewable energy. And then I think it's important to also work with existing organizations. And today you guys get to meet with some great people that'll be out at the tables, that'll be on these panels up here, knowing what local people are doing, supporting them, whether they're fighting against natural gas pipelines or power plants. That work, I think, is extremely important to slow down the building of new fossil fuel infrastructure that will be around for 40 or 50 years at the least. We're still using power plants that were built in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And so if we're going to build more of this stuff, it's going to be around. And you guys saw that the science requires that we get off of the fossil fuels entirely in 18 years. So the idea of building new ones is a bad idea. And networking across groups in other areas, that is, that are working on other social concerns, because there's an opportunity for much broader based support. So here's just an example in our state in Rhode Island. We've put forward with groups of students working with alumni who, are legislators, got elected right after they graduated from Brown University, where I teach. So we passed a bill called the Resilient Rhode Island Act in 2014, which set targets for the state of 85% emission reductions by 2050. Here we are at a press conference. That board is like all the business groups that we had endorse our legislation. This is Aaron Regenberg. He's our hero. He's a Brown alum. He's now been out about 4 years, and he's now running for lieutenant governor after being a representative for 4 years. Really exciting guy, and he's really helped us with our carbon pricing legislation, this Energize Rhode Island Act. So we're introducing it for the 4th year. This is like right after we passed the Resilient Rhode Island Act. It was very exciting. It was a great experience. So I have a lab group, just to say what I do. We have been really at the local level doing that kind of stuff. Now we're trying to expand it to a whole green agenda package. And we work with these different local groups. We have a whole coalition of organizations, businesses included, but mostly environmental organizations. We work with the city. We've helped create some other coalitions, the Citizens Climate Lobby, and we're working across New England and so on. And then at the international level, I said I take my students to the UN talks, and we work with groups in Bangladesh and England and Germany, and then the global network of NGOs called Climate Action Network, or CAN International. And then at the national level, this is the part that I'm just starting, which is going to be a whole new research project on the flows of funding, ideas, and influence for and against climate change action, so in the United States. So that's because I think that's kind of where a lot of this problem is. So there's been a big response, even locally in Rhode Island, about some of the things that Trump has been doing on climate change. This is a teach-in down here on the left that students organized. It had like 300 people. It was fantastic. Here's a protest at our senator's office on some of the appointments that he made, and so on. So there's where we've been. Do I need to review them? No. Happy to take your questions and talk about this. My main message is that there's hope. It's exciting. I mean, I've been working on climate change for 25 years. Sometimes it's discouraging. You need to take care of yourself if you are aware of this issue. It's scary. It's depressing. But it's also an opportunity for us to build a better society, and there's a reason for it. It's a broad-based issue that can bring a lot of people together. And I think it's, as an academic person, it's exciting and interesting, and it's always something new. So thank you very much. I look forward to some discussion.
Can you take questions? Okay.
Sure.
I've got 3, actually.
Come on up and get in line.
Yeah. First one is,
the
tentacles of the fossil fuel industry and being the fact that it's 100 years old. Have you seen, in your opinion, the company evolve from a fossil fuel company to an energy company? The commercials make it sound like they're growing energy out of algae. Have you actually seen an impetus for that company to change? It's not only a public profile, but actually make a difference in that arena.
Yeah, so I think they have invested in public relations, but environmental movement has not, and especially on the need for climate action. So at least there would be more balance if there was some more.
They're actually finding sources outside of the fossil fuel to grow energy, such as algae.
Yeah.
I mean, they're presenting that in commercials.
Right.
I don't know if that's smoke and mirrors.
Right. So I think there are potentials for these companies to reinvent themselves as renewable energy champions.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. However, I'm a little skeptical based on some history, and that is, like, for example, Beyond Petroleum, a campaign by BP, British Petroleum.
Sure.
And they, bought up solar companies, and then they shut them down, a few years later.
Well,
I'm concerned about that.
Okay.
So, and you always hear about the tiny amount of money they're spending on, on Gulf restoration, and you don't hear about the money that they're spending in Washington to undermine, efforts to restore the Gulf or address climate change.
Okay. The second question is more of a biological question. I have one biological, the other one's more of a feasibility side. Temperate zones will change. Does that play in with the charting of how possibly some of this carbon emission can be reabsorbed in forests that would not grow forest right now, higher altitudes, phytoplankton, more food, more consumption? Yeah,
so you'll have to talk to a climate modeler and and some biologists on that. I was a biologist, and then I became a sociologist.
Okay.
I would say it's an extremely risky thing to count on.
Sure.
It may happen. I kind of doubt it. I mean, the tropics have most of the carbon that's sequestered on the Earth, especially in the amount of carbon that's being sequestered. I mean, the lungs of the planet are really the phytoplankton off the continental shelves. Okay. And so if we're destabilizing that with the amount of carbon that's going into the oceans and acidifying the oceans, that's extremely perilous. Some people will certainly win and some will lose. I mean, will Canada increase its agricultural productivity? Will forests be growable in those places? Maybe, probably. But, I mean, the devastation and the disruption of the food systems and forests, even in the whole tropical belt, is horrifying.
Okay.
We should let other people ask questions, I think. Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I don't mean. Come on, get students up here. Come on.
Okay, I'm with 350 New Orleans. We're working on issues of climate change. That's our main issue. And I just wanted to say that we are currently in a fight in New Orleans against a gas-fired power plant that Entergy wants to build.
Yes.
The city council is the regulatory agency. That's a unique position we are in New Orleans. So we can really fight locally. The vote is coming up soon. Tomorrow is a utility committee meeting. The vote will likely be on February 21st. We have a table outside with more detailed information. If you want to speak up, it would be great if people come to utility committee meetings and speak up against this insane idea.
Yeah. So just on that, I just want to encourage students to do that. I mean, you don't have to show up at every hearing. You don't have to, be an expert on everything. You learn by doing this, and also there's great opportunities to learn about public policy, how it's made, where are the points in the sort of the political system and the policy making system where you can have an input and an impact. And I would say students make a big impact. You may not be from Louisiana, but Louisiana politicians and regulators might consider you Louisiana's future. That is, you might stay here. And you might mention that in your testimony. I'd like to stay here, but I'm worried about X. I care about Louisiana because I've been here for 4 years. I've talked to people who I know this is going to have an impact on. And you can make, global arguments about why fossil fuel infrastructure is a bad idea. So stop by the 350 table and outside.
Hi.
Hi.
My question is, how do you suggest getting individuals involved or to care about this, or do you think that the change is really in getting institutions or countries to totally shift the way that they create energy?
That's a great question, and I think really the institutions and the countries and so on aren't going to shift without popular pressure, even as your Vice President Norton said, right? I mean, Tulane isn't going to reduce its emissions and make a really bold pledge unless students are pushing it. But in order for students to push it, they have to care. And I think there's a lot to know about communication. I hope you can stay for Catherine Hayhoe's talk later. She's a real expert on climate communication. I think it's at 3-something this afternoon, 3:30. She's really a national expert on that. There's a lot to it. I think, good communication and good interaction, it has to be sort of a long-term thing. You're not going to convince somebody with just one flyer or one video or something. It's got to be, I think, long-term engagement. I don't know if that's enough of an answer. I'm just kind of affirming your question and saying, yes, that's an important one. Do I have, the magic bullet on how to have people care and act? No. We need everybody. This is the other thing about this movement and this issue is that we need all kinds of people who have different kinds of skills. And so
you said a lot about how we need to have goals for decreasing our greenhouse gas emissions and such. But I feel with all the way that we live in America and a lot of other developed countries so luxuriously, do you think it's possible to live in the same way by decreasing those greenhouse gas emissions and using green energy and cleaner sources of energy? Do you think they'll be sufficient enough to have the same life, or will people have to adjust to life?
You're asking the tough, important question. So I did an analysis with a woman named Julia Steinberger, who's at the Leeds University now in England, and it's about whether you can have high income and low emissions. Historically, you can't. There's no country that's really living within our carbon budget that's high income. There are some that are really efficient, like Costa Rica is a global example of a country that's using almost no carbon. Their whole electricity system is renewables. They have hydro, which helped them out a lot, and then they've also started to shift. They have a pretty good life. I mean, they have a life expectancy that's actually as high as the United States. So you can have life expectancy and quality of life, but you may not have as much income and stuff. That's historically. So that whole analysis is based on history. And really, we can't point to countries really making the hard choices on climate change, and this conversion is just happening now, so we don't know what's possible in the future. I mean, I think it is, sort of the Tesla model, right, for dealing with climate change, where everybody has an expensive car and solar panels on their roof and a big battery in their garage, is one that only works for the 5%, right, or the top 5%. It's not equitable. It's not taking care of, the majority in the United States, let alone in the world. So I personally think there needs to be adjustment in our lifestyle, to get to your point. I think that's where you're going with your point, right? And I think we need to re-envision those, though. I mean, I don't want to just be up here telling people you have to sit in the cold in the dark, because I don't think you do, right? I think you're actually going to be sitting in the warm, in the light, and with more people doing more interesting things that are more fulfilling, if you can, adjust your community, build a community around local economies and local social organizations. And anyway, I think there's a lot of things about our culture that we think we're better off because of our luxuries, and it's really making us lonely and depressed. I mean, that's just scientifically factual. The U.S. rates of depression, anxiety, loneliness, suicide, and so on are the highest in history in the world. So anyway, I think there's a lot to be gained by acting on this issue.
Yeah. So people need to change their values.
I think changing values is a really big part of this, yeah. Especially if it leads to changing action. One more question.
My question is, if you're interested in going into environmental work in terms
Yep.
of government work, but feel kind of disillusioned with the current administration,
Yeah.
how do you kind of enter those spaces as kind of having opposing views?
That's a lovely, can you guys hear, did you hear the question? So, how to work in the government.
Yeah, essentially.
So it's interesting because I bring students to Washington, D.C. I have for years, and have these government people who have worked during, Republican and anti-climate action administrations and through Democratic ones, and they just somehow, they're civil servants, they just mush through. I don't know how they do it. I would find it, this are people in the State Department who have to go and defend, pretty crappy positions, or pretty good ones. I mean, I don't know how they manage it, but they've, what one of those guys would say was that, elections matter. I'm here to represent an administration that was elected by the people of the United States. So I think that kind of mentality can help. I think that public employees are making a big difference right now. They're trying to do the right thing. The right thing, whatever that means, in my opinion. They're, many of them are trying to have the science of climate change inform our national policy. But there are also lots of other places to participate in governing, at the state levels, at local levels, working in nonprofits that do a lot of the work of governing, and contracting companies that, if you look at, for example, U.S. work on climate change in developing countries, most of it's done by private contracting firms. There's a lot of ways to do work without being totally soaked into the government bureaucracy. But let me just say one last thing, because I think those public employees would say it, that there is an honor in serving the public, and all of them are really proud of their work, even if it drives them crazy sometimes to be in, a slow bureaucracy. And they really encourage young people to look into it. Try it, see if you like it.
Can I ask one more quick question?
Can she? 1 minute. Uh-oh.
Okay. We talked about climate injustice, and I feel like that's especially relevant in New Orleans.
Yeah.
What do you think is the best way to mitigate environmental injustice and environmental racism when there's kind of, like, when it's hard to compete against big oil companies and big chemical companies that have all that funding and have all that, because I know, like, the financial aspect is really important. So how do, like, the little guys essentially raise money or even kind of combat wealthier enemies, so to speak?
So I would say, you know, they have the money, but, you know, the people have their credibility and their, you know, if people pay attention to the legislature, you know, who's getting elected, inform the voters on what's, you know, what these people voted for. Pay attention to the bureaucracies. You know, is the, you know, DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality, actually, you know, enforcing rules fairly in minority communities and low-income communities. I think, you know, being engaged with local NGOs and frontline communities, as they're called, right? Those who are on the front line of the fossil fuel impacts really can make a huge difference in sort of just tipping that. You know, it's very unbalanced. I totally agree with you, but just tipping it enough. There have been important victories in Louisiana that are, you know, the result of persistence and good organizing and amazing community work, and universities have been really important. And you're going to hear from Beverly Wright in a few minutes. I see her back there. And she's been working with some of those communities for a long time. But I do think that, you know, people can make a big difference if they're well organized and have good messages and get them out there and do the hard work of reaching out. Thank you all very much.